But the peace on the farm didn't last long. That night, just as they finally allowed themselves to relax, the wind began to rise. At first, it was just a whisper among the trees, but soon it turned into a furious roar, bending branches and shaking the walls of the house. The rain lashed against the roof, and lightning illuminated the yard in sharp flashes. Then a loud crash. John bolted upright in bed, his heart pounding. Something had fallen outside. In the darkness, a muffled animal cry echoed through the storm. "John!" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. He rushed to the door, ignoring the biting cold, and ran outside. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet. He swung the lantern toward the yard and froze. The chicken coop was destroyed. The wooden planks lay scattered, and in the gaping hole, fresh tracks led straight into the forest. The fox had escaped again. Chapter 1. The First Alarm. The morning sun slowly crept through the window, casting a soft golden glow over the small, cozy cottage. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, filling the room with warmth and comfort. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, but the blanket of warmth lingered in the space. Birds outside were already awake, chirping their songs to announce the new day. In the small farmhouse nestled in the countryside, life was simple, peaceful, and yet always full of little surprises. John and Emma, a retired couple in their late 60s, had lived on this farm for decades. Their lives were intimately connected to the rhythm of the land, to the seasons, to the animals they cared for. Every day was an unspoken dance of duties and love, as they tended to their animals, their garden, and each other. They were both seasoned by time, and yet their hearts were as young as the day they met. John was already awake, his strong hands carefully running through his gray beard as he gazed out of the window, watching the morning unfold. Emma, still curled up beneath the soft quilt, stirred beside him. Her small, delicate figure fit perfectly into the space beside him, as it had for all these years. She smiled softly, sensing the new day's energy, and stretched slowly, waking up fully. "Good morning, love," she whispered, her voice warm, like honey. "Morning, Emma," John replied, turning to her with a small grin. "Ready to face the day?" With a chuckle, Emma pushed herself up into a sitting position. "Always. But first," she added with a slight frown, "I should probably check the garden. I noticed something strange yesterday." John raised an eyebrow, concern flitting across his face. "What do you mean?" Emma swung her legs out of bed and placed her feet gently on the cool wooden floor. Her knees creaked slightly as she stood, the familiar discomfort of age reminding her of its presence. She looked out the window, her sharp eyes catching sight of something that made her pause. "Look at the garden, John," she said, her tone now more serious. "Do you see that?" John squinted into the distance, his eyes adjusting to the light. The garden, which had always been so neat and orderly, now had small mounds of earth scattered around it. Small hills of dirt, like miniature mountains, had popped up in several places. As he watched, a few more seemed to appear before his eyes. "Ah, I see," he said with a sigh. "Looks like we have some visitors, all right? Moles." Emma's face darkened. "Moles?" "John, those aren't just moles. Look at the size of those holes. Those are—" "Yes," John cut her off, his voice grim. "That's the work of crats. I've seen them before. Those little devils can ruin a garden in no time." She stood still for a moment, her hand lightly resting on the windowsill as she continued to observe. But why now? Why this late in the season? John's thoughts were racing. He had dealt with these pests before, but never like this. They had always been a nuisance, digging small holes here and there. But this was different. The mounds of dirt were not small, and they seemed to appear in places where the soil was most fertile, just where they had planted their vegetables and herbs. "I'll go out there and take a look," John said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I'll reinforce the edges of the garden. Keep them out for now." Emma nodded, still deep in thought. "Please be careful, John. I don't want you getting hurt." With a soft smile, John kissed her gently on the cheek and grabbed his coat. As he walked to the door, he glanced back at Emma, who was already gathering her knitting basket. "Don't worry about me, Emma. I've handled worse." But as soon as he stepped outside, the full extent of the problem hit him. The garden was practically infested with molehills and craters. He could see the fresh tracks in the soft soil and the telltale signs of disturbance where the little creatures had burrowed in and out. The air was thick with tension. Something had to be done, and quickly. John set to work, grabbing a shovel and starting to fill in the largest of the holes. He knew it was a temporary fix, but at least it would slow them down for a while. He carefully spread the dirt, tamping it down to cover the burrows, but he could tell that wasn't going to be enough. The more he filled in, the more seemed to appear. Meanwhile, Emma had quietly come outside, leaning on her cane. She watched John as he worked, her heart filled with a sense of unease. She knew him well enough to understand that he was trying to stay calm, but the frustration was evident in the way he muttered under his breath. She wanted to help him, but she knew she couldn't with her leg still healing. "John, be careful," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. John paused for a moment, hearing the concern in her voice. He turned to give her a reassuring smile, but before he could say anything, his foot caught on something. A hidden hole beneath the ground. He stumbled forward, catching himself, but only for a moment. And then, without warning, Emma's scream echoed across the yard. John's heart skipped a beat as he turned just in time to see Emma fall, her foot plunging into one of the large holes. "Emma," he shouted, rushing toward her. She cried out in pain as she tried to pull herself up, but her foot had twisted unnaturally beneath her. Her face contorted with the effort, and she fell back, clutching her leg. John knelt beside her in panic, his hands trembling as he gently lifted her leg. "Emma, no, no, no." "John," Emma whispered, her voice weak and strained. I think I've broken it." Her words sent a chill down his spine. He had seen his fair share of accidents, but this was different. He could feel her pain, the way her body tensed in reaction. He couldn't lose her like this, not now. Not when they had so much left to do together. "Hold on, Emma. Just hold on," John said through gritted teeth. He reached out to steady her, his mind racing with what to do. He had to get her inside. He had to keep her calm. He had to. As he lifted her into his arms, he could see the fear in her eyes. The quiet resolve that usually accompanied her strength had slipped away. She wasn't just frightened for herself. She was frightened for him, for their life together. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen." John held her tightly, his heart aching with both fear and love. "Sure, it's not your fault, Emma. I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you're all right." But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an accident. Something had shifted in the air today, something they couldn't yet understand. And as he carried her back into the house, he knew that the day ahead would bring more challenges than they could have ever anticipated. The farm, once a peaceful haven, had already begun to test them. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. Caring for the Wounded. John gently helped Emma back into their cozy bedroom, where the familiar smell of lavender and fresh linens gave the room a comforting, almost serene atmosphere. He carefully lowered her onto the bed, making sure her injured leg was propped up on a cushion as she winced with pain. "Let me just get the bandages," John murmured, his voice filled with quiet urgency. His hands were shaking slightly, not from the physical exertion of carrying her, but from the fear of not knowing what else to do. He had done his best to stabilize her in the yard, but now it was time for more care, more reassurance that everything would be okay. He found the first aid kit and moved quickly, applying the bandages around her leg with practiced hands. As he worked, Emma lay back against the pillow, her eyes closed in a mix of exhaustion and discomfort. Despite the throbbing pain in her leg, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt. She had always been the one to help around the farm, tending to the animals, managing the garden, keeping everything running smoothly. Now, she was forced to lie there, dependent on John, who already had more than enough on his plate. "You're doing just fine, Emma," John said as he carefully secured the bandage. "I've got this, don't you worry." Emma opened her eyes, giving him a faint smile. I'm not worried about that, John. It's just, I hate feeling like I'm useless. You're not useless, he replied firmly, sitting down beside her. You've done more than your fair share already. Now it's my turn to take care of you. She nodded, though the worry still lingered in her gaze. Just promise me you'll take it easy. Don't push yourself too hard. Okay? John chuckled softly. I'll take it easy. As much as I can, anyway. With that, he made sure she was comfortable, adjusting the blankets around her and ensuring she had everything she might need within reach. He kissed her gently on the forehead, his love for her deep and unwavering, but also laced with concern. I'll check on you throughout the day. Don't try to get up unless it's absolutely necessary. Emma gave him a small nod, and John stood up, ready to face the mountain of work that lay ahead. He knew the day wasn't going to be easy. The animals still needed to be fed, cleaned, and looked after. The garden, too, needed attention, but all that had to wait until Emma was settled. As John made his way outside, the house felt quieter than usual. Without Emma's gentle voice guiding him or her hands helping with the chores, the place seemed almost too still. He couldn't help but notice how the silence stretched between each task, how every movement now felt just a little more laborious, and the weight of it all seemed to settle in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he relied on Emma's presence, not just in her physical work, but in her quiet companionship. He started with the pigs. Their grunts and squeals greeted him as he opened the barn door. He went through the motions of feeding them, scraping their pens, and making sure they were comfortable. It was a simple task, but even with the familiarity of it all, John felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion creep into his bones. It wasn't just the physical labor. He felt the emotional toll of the situation, the worry for Emma, and the growing weight of responsibility now resting solely on his shoulders. After the pigs, it was time to tend to the rabbits. They needed fresh hay, food, and water. John went through the process methodically, but each task felt like it took more out of him. The sight of the animals, their innocent eyes and soft coats, reminded him of how everything had changed. Just yesterday, he and Emma had been laughing together, working side by side. Now, everything felt out of sync, unbalanced. He moved on to the cows, who seemed to sense his distress. Their gentle lowing and patient nature was a balm to his restless heart. He spent a few extra minutes with them, rubbing their massive sides and talking to them softly. They were so calm, so understanding. It was a small comfort in the midst of everything else that was going on. By the time he was done with the chores, John felt the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. His body ached, his mind was tired, and he knew he wasn't even close to being finished. Emma was still in the bedroom, resting but needing care, and he hadn't even begun to think about the garden yet. The garden, the moles. He still had to deal with that too. As he came back into the house, he found Emma sitting up slightly in the bed, her eyes closed but her lips moving in a quiet murmur. She wasn't sleeping, but she was resting. Her face was pale, and the pain was still evident in her eyes. But even so, she gave him a warm smile when he entered. "How are you feeling?" John asked as he sat down beside her. "Better," she replied, though it was clear she was still struggling. "Thank you for everything, John. You've been so patient with me." "Of course," he said softly. "It's my turn to take care of you now." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you're not getting worn out, taking care of all of this by yourself?" John didn't want to admit how true that was. Instead, he smiled and kissed her forehead again. "I'm fine, really. I just need to keep busy, that's all." Emma nodded, clearly unconvinced, but she didn't push further. Instead, she offered him what comfort she could, despite her own pain. "Just remember to rest when you can. You're not invincible, you know." John chuckled softly, even though the situation felt anything but funny. "I'll try." The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks and care. As the sun began to set and the farmhouse grew dimmer, John sat down with Emma, who had managed to read a few pages from her favorite book, a small distraction that helped pass the time. The house was peaceful again, the quiet almost reassuring. But as night fell, That peace was shattered by a strange noise from outside. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that sound. It was the unmistakable sound of frantic rustling, the telltale noise of something trying to move stealthily through the yard. Emma's voice, weak but still sharp, called from the bed. "What's that, John?" John grabbed his coat and hurried to the window, his eyes scanning the dim yard. In the shadows, he could make out movement. There was something out there. His stomach sank as he realized what was happening. "That's the sound of something taking our ducks." "Emma," he muttered, "the fox is back." It wasn't just the garden that was under siege. Now, they were losing their animals one by one. And John knew that with Emma unable to help, it was all on him to protect what they had left. Chapter 3. The Fox on the Hunt. The next morning, John awoke early, his mind already clouded with thoughts of the previous night. He could still hear the distant rustling in the yard, the shadow of something slipping through the underbrush, and the stark realization that the fox had been making its rounds again. He had hoped that his instincts were wrong, that it was just a false alarm. But when he walked outside and saw the empty pen where the ducklings and goslings had been, his heart sank. The small, soft bodies that had once waddled about the yard now lay scattered around, feathers and soft down left behind in the dirt. There was no sign of struggle. The fox had come silently and taken them in the dead of night. The loss was not just an inconvenience. It felt like a blow to everything they had worked so hard for. They had raised those little ones with such care, and now they were gone, carried away by the same predator that had caused trouble before. John crouched down, running his hand over the empty ground, trying to understand how it had all happened. He knew the fox would be back. It always came back. The question was how to stop it this time. Emma's voice, soft but steady, drifted from the house as he turned to head back inside. "What happened? Did we lose more?" John took a deep breath before answering, his voice tight with frustration. "Yes, Emma. The fox took the ducklings and the goslings. All of them, just like before." She said nothing for a moment, but he could hear her shifting in the bed, the familiar rustle of the quilt. "That fox is relentless," she muttered, though her voice was filled with a mixture of sorrow and quiet defiance. "It's been hunting us for weeks, but we can't just give up. We need to stop it." John crossed to her bedside, pulling a chair close to where she lay. She had been resting through most of the morning, but the news of the loss had pulled her out of her quiet stupor. She propped herself up with pillows, her face drawn but resolute. "We can't lose any more, John. Not now," she said, her eyes meeting his with a sharp clarity that belied her pain. "We need to think of something clever. You've dealt with foxes before. What can we do?" John scratched his beard, looking over at the window where the sun was slowly rising. "We can set traps again, but the fox seems to know how to avoid them. It's like it's learned something about them. The last time it got too close, but I wasn't quick enough." Emma's gaze softened. "But you can't give up, John. We have to try again. Maybe we need to change the approach. Is there anything else we can do?" He took a deep breath, not wanting to admit how tired he felt. The stress from looking after the farm, tending to Emma, and dealing with the ever-growing list of problems was starting to wear him thin. Still, he wouldn't let the animals suffer if there was something he could do. "I'll build new traps, maybe set them in places where we haven't before, and I'll make sure they're well hidden, like last time. If we can't catch it with the first set, we'll try again. But we need to be patient." Emma nodded, her eyes clouded with concern. "And we need to keep the others safe. We can't let it get to the rest of the animals." "Of course," John replied. "I'll lock up the pens tighter, and I'll check on them more often. If I can't catch the fox, I'll keep the rest safe at least." With that plan in place, John went about setting the traps throughout the yard. He spent hours scouring the property, looking for the most likely routes the fox might take. He laid the bait carefully, making sure everything was perfectly placed, but deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wouldn't be enough. The fox was cunning, and it had already proven its ability to outwit him. By evening, John had finished. He stepped back to admire his work, feeling a twinge of pride despite his uncertainty. The traps were well concealed, and he had made sure to block off the most likely escape routes. He was ready for the fox to come back. But would it? As night descended, the farm grew quiet again. The wind rustled through the trees, and the only sound was the gentle clucking of the hens in their coops. John took one last look around, ensuring everything was in order before heading inside. Emma had fallen asleep by the fire, her face peaceful for the first time in days. He paused for a moment at the door, taking in the sight of the woman he loved, so strong despite the pain she was in. But even in this moment of calm, John couldn't relax. He knew that the fox was still out there, and it would come for them again. He just hoped he was ready. Hours passed in a restless slumber. John tossed and turned, the sounds of the farm filtering into his dreams, mixing with the sounds of the wind and the occasional rustling outside. Then, at the edge of his consciousness, he heard it. A faint sound, a soft rustle, too quiet to be anything but deliberate. John's heart leaped. He was wide awake in an instant, his hand reaching for his coat and boots. His mind raced as he silently crept to the window. His breath fogged up the glass as he peered out into the dark yard. There it was, the shadow moving in the distance, swift and almost invisible against the night. The fox. It was coming for the animals again. He grabbed his rifle from its place by the door and carefully made his way outside, stepping softly on the ground. He didn't want to scare it off just yet. He needed to wait, to be patient, to make sure the fox was close enough to fall into the trap. But as he crouched low behind the barn, something unexpected happened. The fox paused. For a brief moment, it seemed to sense something, perhaps the smell of the traps or the air around it. It stopped in its tracks and looked around, almost as though it knew it was being watched. John held his breath, waiting. The fox stared out across the yard, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Then, with a swift movement, it darted to the side, avoiding the trap with ease. John's heart sank as he realized what had happened. The fox had escaped again. Frustration rose up in him like a tidal wave, threatening to consume him. He felt the weight of failure bearing down on him. Despite all his planning, despite all his effort, the fox had outsmarted him once more. It was as if the predator was always one step ahead, always aware of his every move. He lowered his rifle with a sigh, cursing under his breath. His mind was clouded with defeat, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The fox would come again, but so would he. And when it did, John would be ready, because sometimes the battle wasn't won in a single fight, but in the persistence of the struggle. And just as he was about to turn back to the house, something caught his eye. There, just at the edge of the trees, the fox appeared again. It wasn't running this time. No, it was standing still, watching him with its gleaming eyes. This time, the game was on. Chapter 4. The Test of Patience. The next morning, John woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The failure from the night before still weighed heavily on him, but he knew he couldn't give in to frustration. He couldn't let the fox win. Not now, not when everything they had worked for was on the line. The sky was still overcast as he stepped outside, the air thick with moisture. A cold breeze swept across the yard, making the trees sway in a gentle dance. John took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of defeat. He had to keep moving forward. He headed to the fence first, inspecting the areas where the fox had been sneaking in. It wasn't just the traps that needed attention. The fence itself was getting worn down in places, parts of it sagging and others falling apart. The thought of a predator sneaking through cracks in the barrier made his skin crawl. He needed to fortify it, and quickly. With determined hands, he set to work, hammering nails into the wooden posts, repairing gaps in the mesh wire, and tightening loose parts of the fence. His movements were quick and practiced, but his mind was far from the task at hand. He kept thinking of the fox, how elusive it was, how smart, how it had evaded his best efforts again and again. As he worked, the weather seemed to shift, and the soft breeze turned into something far more aggressive. Dark clouds began to gather overhead, and before long, the wind started howling, twisting through the trees. John paused for a moment, squinting into the distance. The storm was coming in fast, and he knew he had to finish reinforcing the fence before the rain hit. As the wind picked up speed, he worked even faster, his hands moving deftly despite the tightening knot of anxiety in his chest. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going before the storm was on top of him. The sky had turned a deep shade of gray, and the first raindrops began to fall, plopping against his coat with increasing intensity. He didn't stop. The animals needed him. The farm needed him. Back in the house, Emma lay propped up in bed, watching the storm through the window. She could see John out there, his figure a small silhouette against the oncoming rain. The sight made her heart ache. She hated that she couldn't be out there with him, helping in any way she could. But her leg was still too swollen, still too painful to put weight on, and she had to rely on him completely for the moment. The thought made her feel helpless, and she hated it. But then she thought of something, a memory from their younger days, and a small smile tugged at her lips. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, and in the silence of the room, she began to speak, her voice soft and calm. "You know, John," she said to herself, as though the words were meant to comfort him, even from afar, "when we were younger, I used to think you were the most stubborn man on earth. Remember that time you tried to fix the barn roof by yourself? We were barely married then, and I was so worried you were going to fall off and break your neck." She paused for a moment, remembering the laughter that had filled their small house during that time. "But you just kept on, didn't you? No matter how many times I told you to wait for help, you refused. And you did it all on your own. Every time I see you out there, working without stopping, it takes me right back to that day." Emma chuckled softly, the sound light and full of affection. "You were always so stubborn, but I loved you for it." She let the memory of their younger years settle in her heart for a moment before she spoke again. "Don't lose heart, John. You've always found a way when it seemed impossible. And you'll find a way now. I know you will." Her words, though whispered, felt like a balm to her own soul. She imagined John hearing them, even though he was far away, struggling with his task. It was a small thing to say, but it made her feel a little less helpless, a little more connected to him despite the distance between them. Outside, John heard the wind pick up again, whipping through the trees with a fury that made the house creak in the distance. His heart raced as the rain began to fall harder, pelting the ground with an unforgiving force. The storm had arrived in full force, and there was little he could do to stop it now. The animals were safe, locked away in their pens, but the storm was making his work much more difficult. The fences were slippery, and the soil around him turned to mud, making it harder to secure the posts. The rain soaked through his coat, chilling him to the bone, but still he kept working. "Just a little more," he muttered to himself. "Just a little more." The wind howled louder as if to challenge him, but John pushed on. His hands were raw from the constant work, his body sore from the effort. Yet, in the back of his mind, he held on to one thought: he had to finish. The fox wouldn't wait for the storm to pass. By late afternoon, the storm had turned into a full-fledged downpour, the rain falling in sheets, blurring the landscape. John had worked through most of the storm, fortifying the fence and setting up additional traps. He wasn't sure if they would work, but he had done everything he could. He knew he needed a break. His body was telling him it was time to stop. He walked back into the house, soaked through, his clothes sticking to his skin. Emma was still in bed, looking out the window with a worried expression. She was glad to see him, but he could see the concern in her eyes. "How's the fence?" she asked, her voice gentle. John gave a tired smile, wiping rainwater from his brow. "It's done for now. I've reinforced the weak spots, and I've set new traps. We'll just have to wait and see." Emma's expression softened with relief, but she didn't comment on the exhaustion in his eyes. She knew he had worked harder than ever that day, and for a moment, the weight of it all hung heavy in the air between them. But Emma smiled, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. "You've done your best, John. I'm proud of you," she said, her voice steady and calm. John smiled back at her, though it was a tired smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just hope it's enough." As night fell and the storm raged outside, the house felt quieter than usual, a calm before the storm's true fury. But despite the exhaustion, despite the challenges of the day, there was one small glimmer of hope. The storm had passed. Tomorrow was a new day, and with it, new possibilities. The next morning, John would discover something unexpected. As the storm clouds cleared and the sun came out from behind the darkened sky, he would walk outside to check on his traps, and one of them would have triggered. But the trap had caught something much different than he expected. It was not the fox. It was something, or rather someone, he hadn't anticipated. And his patience would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Chapter 5. The calm before the storm. The storm had passed, and with the first break of sunlight, the farm seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. John stood at the window, looking out over the yard, still damp from the heavy rains. The sky had cleared, and although the wind had quieted, he could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing on him. His body was tired, his muscles aching from days of work, and his mind was weary from the constant stress. The tasks seemed endless, and the pressure of keeping everything in order was starting to wear on him. It had been weeks since Emma's accident, and while she was healing, the strain of caring for her, as well as the farm, had taken its toll. The animals were demanding as ever, and the persistent threat of the fox weighed heavily on him. Yet, in this rare moment of quiet, John knew that if he didn't take a step back, he'd risk burning out. Maybe a day or two to rest wouldn't hurt, he muttered to himself, rubbing his tired eyes. John moved slowly, almost mechanically, through the house as he considered the idea of rest. It felt strange, almost indulgent, to think about stopping when there was so much to do. But Emma had always been his rock, the one who reminded him that even in the busiest of times, it was important to find moments of peace. As he walked into the living room, his gaze fell upon Emma, resting in her favorite chair by the window. Her leg, though still in a splint, had healed considerably. She looked up at him with a soft smile, her eyes bright despite the weariness that lingered in her face. "Have you thought about taking a break?" Emma asked gently, reading the exhaustion in his posture. "You've been pushing yourself too hard, John." John hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew she was right. He needed time to recover, for both his body and his mind. And, for the first time in days, he allowed himself to consider the idea of taking it easy, if only for a little while. "I think you're right," he finally said. "Maybe we can take a couple of days and just rest. We've both earned it." With that decision made, John set about preparing the house for a quiet evening. He started by gathering wood for the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. The scent of pine filled the air as he stacked the logs in the hearth. It was a small task, but it brought him comfort, a reminder of simpler days when the rhythms of farm life weren't so fraught with worry. Emma watched him with a fond smile, and when he finished setting the fire, he turned to her. "How about we sit by the fire tonight? No work, no worries. Just us." Emma's eyes softened at the offer, and she nodded. "I'd like that very much." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat together in the flickering light of the fire. The warmth from the flames seemed to seep into their bones, soothing the tension that had built up over the past few weeks. John carefully tucked a blanket around Emma's shoulders, making sure she was comfortable, and then settled into his chair beside her. They didn't speak at first, content to simply be in each other's presence. The crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind, the only sounds in the room. After a long while, Emma broke the silence. "Do you remember when we first started this farm, John? How we didn't know the first thing about raising animals, and every day felt like an adventure." John chuckled softly, a sound full of warmth and nostalgia. "I remember you always telling me I should read more books, that I'd be better off learning from others instead of just winging it, but I couldn't resist the challenge. I wanted to do it my way, even if it meant making mistakes along the way." Emma smiled, her eyes twinkling with affection. "And you did. You made plenty of mistakes, but we always learned together. And now look at us. We've got our little piece of the world here. It's not always easy, but it's ours." They both looked out the window, their gaze lingering on the quiet yard beyond. The animals were settling down for the night, the barn and pens bathed in the soft glow of the fading light. There was a sense of peace in the air, as if the world outside had paused just for a moment, allowing them to breathe. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes tracing the patterns of the flames. We've come a long way, haven't we? But I wonder what the future holds for us. The farm, the animals, all of it. What's next for us, Emma? She thought for a moment, her eyes turning thoughtful. I think we keep going, John. One day at a time. We've got each other, and as long as we have that, we'll figure it out. We always do. John nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. Emma's words were simple, but they carried the weight of years spent together, weathering storms both literal and figurative. They had learned to adapt, to survive, and most importantly, to thrive together. As the night wore on, they both felt a deep sense of contentment. The troubles of the farm, the worry about the fox, and all the challenges they had faced seemed a little further away in this moment of stillness. For the first time in days, John allowed himself to simply relax, knowing that tomorrow was another day, and they would face it together. But as the fire burned lower and the evening grew quiet, a distant sound caught John's ear, the familiar rustle of leaves and the soft patting of paws against the earth. His heart skipped a beat, and he stood up abruptly, his muscles still stiff from the day's work. "Did you hear that?" he asked Emma, his voice tinged with alarm. She looked up at him, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "What is it?" John didn't answer. He moved quickly to the window, peering out into the yard. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the farm, illuminating the dark shapes of the pens and the barn. He scanned the shadows, his eyes narrowing, until he saw it. A small, furtive movement near the duckling pen. The fox. John's heart sank. The predator was back, and this time, it had no intention of letting the farm go unchallenged. "It's the fox," he muttered, his voice hard with resolve. "It's come for the animals again." Emma's expression hardened as well, and despite her injury, she knew what had to be done. "We can't let it take any more, John." He nodded grimly, grabbing his coat and rifle from where they had been left by the door. The calm they had shared earlier was gone, replaced by the urgency of the moment. The storm had passed, but now, another battle awaited them. With the echo of the storm still in the air and the fox lurking just outside, John understood one thing. The peace they had fought so hard to protect was once again under threat. And this time, there would be no rest until the threat was gone. They were entering the storm's eye, and this time, it would take more than just patience to weather it. Chapter 6. The Trap. John stood by the window, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The moonlight bathed the farm in a pale, silvery glow, and the world outside felt eerily still. The events of the previous night were still fresh in his mind, the image of the fox slipping away into the shadows, just out of reach. He knew it wouldn't be long before the creature returned, and when it did, he had to be ready. With a deep sigh, John stepped away from the window, grabbing his coat and heading outside. The night was cold, the air biting at his skin as he made his way toward the barn. He could already hear the soft rustle of the animals settling for the night, the comforting sounds of their familiar routines. But for John, there was no rest tonight. Not yet. He had learned his lesson from the previous attempts at trapping the fox. The traps hadn't been strong enough, not nearly secure enough. This time, he was going to make sure the trap would hold, no matter how cunning the predator was. Walking past the animal pens, he approached the storage shed where he kept his tools. The wooden door creaked as he pulled it open, and the smell of hay and metal filled the air. He scanned the shelves, searching for the materials he needed. He would need strong wire, sturdy posts, and something that would ensure the trap was more than just a temporary fix. The plan had to be foolproof. As he gathered the supplies, his mind raced. The fox had taken several of their animals, and he couldn't afford for it to slip away again. Not when so much was at stake. He couldn't let Emma see him fail, not after everything they had been through. When John returned to the yard, he found himself standing in front of the place where he had seen the fox last. He carefully began to lay the foundation for the trap, his movements precise. His hands were cold, but his focus kept him steady. The trap would be hidden among the bushes, just outside the duck pen. He wanted it to be in a place where the fox would be forced to come close, where it would have nowhere to run. As he worked, John kept thinking about Emma's words. She had always been the practical one, the one who thought things through. He admired her for that. Despite her injury, she hadn't stopped trying to help, and the ideas she'd offered for the trap were clever. She had suggested using the natural terrain to his advantage, creating a path that would lead the fox right into the trap's path. It had been a simple but effective suggestion, and he couldn't have done it without her. John glanced toward the house, where Emma sat by the window watching him. Her face was pale, her legs still propped up on pillows, but she had a determined look in her eyes. She wanted to help, even if she couldn't physically be out there with him. After he finished setting up the trap, John walked over to the pen to check on the animals. His eyes fell on the ducks. The little creatures huddled together for warmth, oblivious to the danger that still loomed. The chickens were tucked safely in their coop, and the rabbits were settled in their cages. But something caught his attention: tracks. Fresh tracks. He crouched down, his heart sinking. The footprints were unmistakable fox tracks. But as he studied the prints more closely, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. There were multiple sets of tracks, not just one. The fox wasn't alone. It had brought others with it. John's pulse quickened as he realized the danger was even greater than he had anticipated. If there were more foxes, the threat was not just to their ducks and geese, it was to all of the animals. And that meant John had to act fast, before the situation escalated even further. He returned to the shed and started crafting more traps, deciding to place them in different locations around the farm. His hands worked quickly, the sense of urgency now driving every movement. He set one trap near the chicken coop, another near the rabbit cages, and a third by the pigsty. The goal was to create a net of sorts, to surround the foxes and trap them all in one go. As he worked, his mind kept replaying the earlier moment, when he had seen the tracks, not just one but several. There was a sense of unease building in him, a quiet dread creeping up from the pit of his stomach. The farm had always been a place of peace, of simplicity, but now it was turning into a battleground, with animals caught in the crossfire. John had never expected it to come to this. By the time he finished setting the traps, the night had grown colder. He returned to the house, his body aching from the long hours of work. Emma was still awake, her eyes following his every move. She could see the worry etched in his features, and her heart went out to him. "Did you set the traps?" she asked softly, her voice filled with concern. John nodded, too tired to speak. He sank into the chair beside her, his exhaustion catching up with him. Emma reached for his hand, giving it a comforting squeeze. "We'll catch them, John," she said quietly. "You've done everything you can. Now we wait." John smiled faintly at her, grateful for her calming presence, even in the face of everything that was happening. "I hope so, Emma. I really hope so." The hours stretched on, and the wind began to howl outside, rattling the windows. John sat beside Emma, his mind unable to settle. He kept thinking about the foxes, about the danger they posed. Sleep didn't come easily to him, but eventually, his exhaustion overtook him, and he nodded off in the chair. The morning light was still faint when John was woken by the sound of something in the yard. His heart leapt into his throat as he leapt to his feet. He rushed to the window, squinting into the dim light. The traps had been triggered, but when John saw what had been caught, he felt his stomach drop. It wasn't a fox. It was something far more unexpected. The trap had caught something, or rather someone he never could have imagined. Chapter 7. Attention to Detail. The morning was crisp, the first rays of sunlight casting a golden hue over the farm. John rubbed his eyes, still groggy from a restless night. The traps had been checked, and while one had been triggered, it wasn't the fox that had been caught. The frustration gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't let it cloud his judgment. He needed a new strategy. As he sipped his morning coffee, Emma watched him from her chair near the fireplace. Despite the injury keeping her confined, her mind was sharp as ever. "You're going about this the wrong way, love," she said, stirring her tea. "You're thinking like a human. You need to think like a fox." John chuckled, shaking his head. And how exactly does a fox think? Emma smiled knowingly. It doesn't just run in blindly. It watches, it waits, it learns where the weaknesses are. You need to do the same. John considered her words. Maybe she was right. Instead of setting traps blindly, he needed to study the fox's movements, its habits. He needed to understand how it thought. Observing the fox. That afternoon, John found himself crouched behind the old wooden fence, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the barn. He had already noticed something important. The fox never attacked during the brightest hours of the day. It always came when the light was dim, when shadows stretched long across the ground. It wasn't just one fox either. The prints he had found told him that much. There was at least one adult, but smaller tracks suggested younger ones. Family. John stayed there for hours, barely moving. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig made his heart pound. Then, just as he was about to give up, movement caught his eye. There it was. A sleek, red-furred figure emerged cautiously from the brush. Its ears twitched, its nose sniffing the air. The fox moved with deliberate steps, keeping low to the ground. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it darted away. It wasn't going for the traps. It was testing. John clenched his fists. Clever little thing. It knew something was wrong. A new plan. Returning to the house, John relayed what he had seen to Emma. She listened intently, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her teacup. So it knows the traps are there, she mused. That means it's been watching you just as much as you've been watching it. That's what worries me, John admitted. If it's this smart, how do we trap it? Emma frowned in thought. We changed the game. She gestured toward the small pile of papers on the table. Fetch my notebook, will you? John handed it to her, watching as she flipped through pages of careful handwriting. Emma had always been meticulous, whether it was planning the farm's planting schedule or making sure the animals were properly cared for. What if, she started, tapping her pen against the paper, instead of trying to catch it. We lure it? John raised an eyebrow. Go on. We set the trap inside the enclosure. Make it want to go in. Something irresistible. John leaned back, thinking. Like food. Emma nodded. Not just food. A safe place. It's got young ones, right? That means it needs shelter too. A slow grin spread across John's face. You might just be onto something. Another problem. Just as they were finalizing the details of the new plan, a sudden, distressed moo broke through the quiet afternoon. John's head snapped up. That's Bessie. He was out of his chair in an instant, rushing outside with Emma calling after him. Bessie, their oldest cow, stood near the fence, one of her back legs bent at an odd angle. John's stomach sank. He approached slowly, speaking in a soft, calming voice. Easy now, girl. Let me see what's wrong. The cow shifted uneasily, clearly in pain. John knelt down, running his hands over her leg. His fingers found a tender, swollen spot near the hoof. She must have stepped in a hole or twisted it somehow. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. With Emma already injured, another setback was the last thing they needed. I'll need to wrap it, he said aloud, mostly to himself. Keep her off it for a while. Emma, watching from the porch, called out, There's some bandages in the shed. Use the liniment too. John hurried off, fetching what he needed. As he worked, gently securing the bandages around Bessie's leg, he sighed. The farm never let up. There was always something, but he wasn't done yet. An unexpected discovery. As he finished tending to Bessie, John noticed something odd. Another set of tracks near the barn. Smaller, lighter. He followed them cautiously, his mind racing. When he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. Near the fence, half hidden in the tall grass, was a tiny, injured fox pup. Its fur was matted, its body curled into a tight ball. It barely moved, its breathing shallow. It had been left behind. John's heart twisted. The fox had been stealing their animals to feed its young, and now one of them was hurt. He exhaled slowly, his mind warring between instinct and compassion. He had spent days trying to trap this creature, And now, fate had placed its young right in front of him. What was he supposed to do now? Chapter 8. Obstacles at every turn. The morning fog lingered longer than usual, wrapping the farm in a thick, ghostly veil. John rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. It had been another restless night. The traps had been untouched, but another duckling was missing. He followed the familiar trail of feathers leading toward the woods, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The fox was relentless. No matter what he did, it found a way. It was as if the creature enjoyed outsmarting him. John clenched his fists. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. Emma's small contributions. Back inside the house, Emma was already awake, sitting up against a pile of pillows. Her face was pale, her legs still propped up with cushions. But despite the pain, she had been finding ways to help. Did it happen again? She asked as soon as John stepped inside. He sighed, placing his hat on the hook. Another one gone. Same trail as before. Emma frowned. We need to change something, John. I have been changing things, he muttered, frustration seeping into his voice. Emma didn't argue. Instead, she reached for the notebook that had become their new battle plan. While you were out, I was thinking, maybe it's not just one fox doing all this. John paused, considering. The idea made sense. He had seen smaller tracks alongside the adults. Emma continued, if it's feeding more than one pup, that means it's getting desperate. Maybe we can use that to our advantage. He ran a hand over his face. She was right. Again. He bent down and gently kissed her forehead. I don't know what I'd do without you, Em. She smirked. Oh, you'd probably still be chasing after that fox like a fool. Falling into your own traps, he chuckled, feeling a little lighter. Then he noticed something, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the notebook. She was in pain. You've been doing too much, he said, frowning. Emma waved him off. Nonsense. I can still help with the pigs. I can't stand the thought of you doing all this alone. John exhaled, knowing better than to argue with her. He helped her into the kitchen, where she could at least prepare the slop while sitting. It was a small task, but it made her feel useful. A visit to the vet. That afternoon, John hitched the old wagon and rode into town. Bessie's injury wasn't getting worse, but he needed to be sure he was treating it right. The town's veterinarian, Dr. Miller, had been around longer than John could remember. She stepped wrong, you say? The vet asked, inspecting the wrapped hoof. Yeah. She's limping, but she's eating fine. Dr. Miller nodded. Could be a sprain. You're doing the right thing keeping it wrapped. Keep her off the leg as much as you can. John sighed. That's the hard part. She doesn't take kindly to standing still. Dr. Miller chuckled. Then she's got that in common with your wife. John smirked. That she does. As he paid for the ointment and fresh bandages, the vet gave him a curious look. You look tired, John. He waved him off. Just farm life. More like fox trouble. I'd bet, Dr. Miller mused. You're not the only one. A few folks around town have been losing chickens. If it's the same fox, you've got a real challenge on your hands. John frowned. You know something about this one? Dr. Miller nodded. Old Red. Been around for years. She's clever, that one. Survived longer than most. But if she's this desperate, she's got little ones to feed. John rubbed his chin. That's what I figured. Dr. Miller leaned forward. If you really want to catch her, don't just trap her. Outsmart her. John left the vet's office with more than just medicine. He left with a plan. Emma's quiet support. Back at home, Emma was waiting for him. I was starting to worry, she said, trying to sound casual. But John saw the concern in her eyes. I'm fine, he reassured her. Picked up what I needed for Bessie. And I think I finally know what to do about that fox. Emma's brows lifted. Oh, he grinned. Old Red's been stealing from other farms too. She's not just smart. She's got history. But now I know what she's really after. Emma's smile was warm. See? I knew you'd figure it out. John sat beside her, taking her hand. I hate leaving you alone all day. She squeezed his fingers. I know, but you're doing what needs to be done. He looked at her, at the way the firelight flickered across her face. He was exhausted, but with Emma beside him, he could keep going. An unexpected clue. Later that evening, as John made his way to the barn, something caught his eye. A disturbance in the dirt near the fence. Kneeling, he examined it closely. A trail. But not just the usual paw prints. This one was different. Tiny claw marks. Not a fox's, but something else. His breath caught. Could it be? Was this the key to everything? John's heart pounded as he followed the trail, knowing it might finally lead to the answer. Chapter 9. The Great Hunt. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and hay. John tightened his grip on the worn handle of his shovel. This was it. He was setting the final trap, the one that would outsmart Old Red once and for all. The farm had been too quiet the last couple of nights, and that only made him more anxious. The fox was planning something. He could feel it. A sudden setback. John dug into the soil near the edge of the fence, where he had seen the last set of tracks. The plan was simple. Dig a deep enough hole, place the bait just right, and make sure the trap triggered at the right moment. But as he lifted the shovel for another strike, there was a sharp crack. The handle snapped in half. John stumbled back, nearly losing his balance. He stared at the broken tool in disbelief. It had been with him for years, weathered and sturdy, until now. Just my luck, he muttered under his breath. Wasting time was not an option, but fixing the trap without the shovel would slow him down. He needed a new plan. Emma's wisdom. Back inside, Emma noticed the frustrated look on his face before he even spoke. Something went wrong? She asked, sipping the herbal tea he had made for her earlier. John sighed and dropped into the chair beside her. Broke my best shovel. Just when I was about to finish the last trap. Emma reached for his hand, her touch gentle yet firm. John, you've been pushing yourself too hard. I can't just stop. He muttered. Not when we're this close. I'm not saying stop. I'm saying slow down, she said, giving him a knowing look. Take a break. Clear your head. The fox isn't going anywhere. John opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. She was right again. Clever trick. After resting for a while, John headed back outside. He thought about what Emma had said. Maybe brute force wasn't the answer. Maybe it was time for a little trickery. He adjusted the trap, using a pile of hay to disguise it better. Then he set the bait, fresh meat, just enough to lure the fox in. But the real trick was the scent trail he laid, leading Old Red exactly where he wanted her. Then he waited. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the fields in a golden glow. The farm was quiet, except for the distant mooing of the cows and the occasional cluck from the chicken coop. Then movement. John held his breath. A shadow crept along the fence line. Then another. It was her. And she wasn't alone. The fox hesitated, sniffing the air. She was wary as always, but hunger won over caution. Step by step, she moved toward the bait. Then snap, the trap triggered. Old Red let out a sharp yelp, startled but unharmed. She was caught. John exhaled, relief washing over him. He had finally done it. Pride and gratitude. Back inside, he found Emma watching from the window. You got her, she said, smiling. John grinned, wiping the sweat from his brow. Took me long enough. Emma reached for his hand. I'm proud of you. John squeezed her fingers gently. Couldn't have done it without you, Em. They sat together for a while, enjoying the quiet triumph. The storm breaks, but peace never lasted long on the farm. That night, as they settled into bed, the wind began to howl. At first, it was just a distant murmur, but soon it grew into a full-blown storm. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the barn for a split second. Then came the thunder, a deep, rolling growl that shook the windows. Then bang! Something outside crashed to the ground. John shot up. What the? Emma's eyes widened. John, be careful. He grabbed his coat and hurried outside. Rain lashed against his face as he stumbled toward the barn. Then he saw it. The wind had torn part of the chicken coop loose, and in the chaos, something had gone terribly wrong. The farm, once again, was thrown into turmoil. Chapter 10. Restoration. The storm had passed, leaving behind a drenched but intact farm. The early morning light painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the fields. John stood at the edge of the barn, breathing in the fresh, rain-washed air. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. A moment of relief. The fox was caught. The animals were safe. And most importantly, Emma was on the mend. John walked around the farm, surveying the aftermath. The chicken coop had taken a hit, but it was nothing he couldn't fix. The cows were restless, their ears flicking at the lingering dampness in the air, but otherwise unharmed. He knelt beside the garden, brushing away a few scattered leaves. The soil was soaked, but the plants had survived. Everything was still standing, just like them, a well-deserved break. Back inside, the scent of freshly brewed tea filled the kitchen. Emma was already awake, sitting by the window with a warm mug in her hands. "You should sit down," she said as he walked in, her eyes filled with both warmth and concern. John chuckled, shaking his head. "You're one to talk." Emma smirked. "I've been resting long enough. You, on the other hand, haven't stopped running since the day I fell." He sighed, pouring himself a cup of tea before finally taking the seat beside her. The warmth seeped into his fingers, soothing his tired bones. "You were right," he admitted after a moment. "Sometimes you need to slow down." Emma smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "See, I do have my moments." Standing together again. Later that afternoon, Emma decided to take her first steps outside. Her leg was still healing, but the crutches helped, and John was right there beside her, steadying her with every move. The familiar sights and sounds of the farm greeted her, the rustling leaves, the clucking chickens, the distant moo of the cows. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly home again. Together, they fed the animals, checked the fences, and even spent time in the garden, plucking away stray weeds. It was slow work, but it was theirs, and it was enough. A quiet sunset. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John and Emma settled on the porch, wrapped in the comfortable silence of shared understanding. The sky burned with streaks of orange and purple, the last remnants of the day fading into twilight. John draped a blanket over Emma's shoulders, pulling her close. "We did it." She let out a soft laugh. "You did most of it." He shook his head. "No, Emma. We did this together." They sat there, listening to the distant sounds of the farm, feeling the steady rhythm of life settling back into place. No more fox, no more chaos. Just them, their home, and the quiet peace they had fought to protect. And in that moment, nothing else mattered.